In this video, I'm going to share with you my prediction for the topics that I predict to be featured in the paper 2 AQA A-level exam 2025. These predictions come from the analysis of the questions over the past 5 years and the trend in the topics and questions in all of these papers. So let's start with the topics that are very common in the exams. These topics, in my prediction or in my expectation, that the majority of these topics will actually be in your exam this year. So let's start with physical chemistry. There is always a question about reaction rate. And when they ask about reaction rate, they ask about the order of the reaction. It became quite common that they give you a table with the concentration and the change in the concentration of different reactant and the initial rate of the reaction based on the order of the reaction for each and every single one of these reactants. Also, the rate determining step, how to decide which step is actually the rate determining step with justification. And it became very common as well to ask you to draw a graph related to the reaction rate. This graph could be simply a change in the concentration of one of the reactant with time, or the change in the volume, or the change in the concentration of the product over time. So there is always some graph to draw. The second topic in physical chemistry is the equilibrium and the calculation of the equilibrium constant, or Kc, the concentration of the different reagents, reactants, and product at equilibrium. And also, when they ask about Kc, they ask about the formula and they ask about the unit. So make sure that you know how to calculate the Kc and answer these type of questions. Moving on to calculations. So there are several questions that will have different calculations coming from the amount of substance topic. And usually there are different types of calculation. It's not like fixed type of calculation, but there is always something. So they like to ask about the how to calculate the percentage composition of something in a sample. So maybe in fat and oil in a sample or whatever. So this is kind of common question. Also, they sometimes ask you to calculate the or to find the empirical formula. And sometimes they ask to find the molecular formula based on the masses or the moles of the products like carbon dioxide and water following the complete combustion of a certain organic molecule. When we move on to the organic chemistry is the majority of your paper two exam, and there are kind of typical questions that will always be in your exam. The first topic here is to identify structures using various analytical techniques, using the IR, carbon-13 NMR, and proton NMR. All these three techniques will always be in the exam. You will never see an exam without all these three techniques. They can either be one long question, or they could be related to different compounds, and they ask you to identify the structure based on the analysis or based on the analytical data. So all of the past papers have different questions, so go ahead and practice these questions until you master how to answer these type of question. And then one of the common questions, or not just one, but I would say at least 30–40% of your exam will be about chemical reactions, organic reactions. And there are certain reactions which are very common, or they are almost in every single exam. They would ask you either to name the reaction or write the reagent for a certain reaction, or to draw the mechanism. But naming the reaction is kind of common for all of the reactions, but sometimes they, in addition to naming, they would ask for the reagent, or they could ask for the mechanism. These reactions are nucleophilic substitution reaction for alkyl halide. So alkyl halide substitution with cyano group or with hydroxide. They are very, very common in your exam, and I doubt that you will ever find an exam without a question that have nucleophilic substitution reaction. Electrophilic addition to double bonds, whether we are talking about addition of halogens or addition of water or even the addition of alkyl halides, hydrogen halides. So you need to master the mechanism of this reaction, especially when you have an unsymmetrical alkene or unsymmetric alkene, and you end up with two different isomers or two different products with a major and minor product. The nucleophilic addition to carbonyl group, very common as well in the exam, and the most types of the nucleophiles that are used in these questions are either cyanide or is the hydride, which is the hydrogen with the negative charge. Be careful that usually when they ask you about the addition of cyanide, especially if it's a ketone, you end up with two different isomers, so they might ask you about the isomers as well. The addition elimination reaction to acid derivatives, and acid derivatives here could be esters or acid chloride or anhydride. Also very common in the exam, and the mechanism is usually asked in the exam a lot. And finally, electrophilic substitution to benzene ring. You will never ever find an exam without electrophilic substitution to benzene. And these electrophilic substitution reactions include the nitration and the Friedrich-Crafts acylation. Nitration is the most common one. Friedrich-Crafts acylation is not that common. Over the past 4 years, I think it only featured one in the exam. So I wouldn't entirely excluded from this year exam because it hasn't been in the exam, I think, the last 2 years. But nitration is like the standard question when it comes to electrophilic substitution. Then there's always questions about isomers. And isomers normally wouldn't be a separate question. They can either be isomers, stereoisomers that come from reactions. For example, when I talked about the nucleophilic addition to carbonyl group and how two different isomers are produced. And then we have the structure isomers, which can either come from reactions, like when you have the major and minor product, or it's simply they could ask you about to identify structures from analytical data. So they last year there was a big question where they gave the molecular formula for different isomers, structure isomers, with the data related to them, analytical data, the hydrogen and the proton NMR, and they asked the question was to identify the structure of the different isomers. And then there will always be a question that is a multi-step reaction. These multi-step reactions usually have these reactions I talked about before. Um, Usually it's not like uncommon reactions. They are very common reactions to you. It's just the structure would be uncommon, but the reactions themselves are common. And they tend to have some products and the steps of the reaction, which are you need to draw these products and missing reagents, and they ask you to draw mechanisms. So all sort of questions within that question. And then usually there is a question where there is a new reaction mechanism you've never seen before. We can never predict what they're going to get you in the exam this year because organic chemistry has so many different reaction mechanisms and no one can read the minds of the examiner. But always expect that there will be a new reaction mechanism, and usually the what they ask you is quite simple because there are usually missing arrows, and they ask you to complete the mechanism by drawing the missing arrow. Just follow the movement of the electrons to draw the missing arrows. And then they will ask you to draw a skeletal formula or displayed formula, usually both of them, not in the same question, of course, but they gonna ask you to, when they ask about the product or ask about a reaction mechanism. They will ask you to draw the skeletal formula of one of the products or one of the reactants, or they're going to ask you to draw the skeletal formula. So these questions are embedded within other questions. So pay attention to the instruction in the question to know which formula you need to use when you draw your structure. And finally, there are recently there are always a practical skill question where they can get you any experiment from the practical skills. And usually these experiments, they don't have to be experiment that you have done one of your practicals, because paper 3 is the one that is mainly about the practical skills. But paper two now, it became very common that there is a question about practical skills. They ask you about the different steps within the reaction, the different use of the reagents, the purification of the product, and also they would ask you to sketch the apparatus used in the experiment. So practice these type of questions from past papers and make sure that you know the basic practical skills when it comes to the topics that are the topics for paper two, so the organic chemistry and the main physical chemistry ones. And then there are topics which are quite common, but they are not in every single exam. So I would never exclude these topics, because if they don't feature, all of them not feature in your exam, at least one or two will be there. So Arrhenius equation was like a common question before in every single exam, but it wasn't in the exam last year, 2024. So I wouldn't exclude it at all this year. And then enthalpy of combustion, calculation of enthalpy of combustion, very, very common in paper two, not in every single exam. I would never exclude that. I would consider this one of the easiest questions in paper two when it comes to physical chemistry, because it's a simple calculation. So please make sure that you practice these type of questions, and you're gonna find many of them in the past papers. Chemical tests for functional group, again, one of the common questions, not in every single exam, but I would never exclude it as well because it's quite common. And then there are the topics that personally I would think that they are most likely to be in the exam this year, because they haven't been in the exam lately, but they are quite common. First of all, the biofuel. So biofuel, one of the kind of hot topics in paper two, but it hasn't been in the exam last year. So I think there might be a question or two related to biofuel this year. And then fat, oil, and saponification. So the hydrolysis of fat and oil using the bases. So this is as well one of the kind of common questions, but again, it's not like every single year, and it wasn't in the exam last year, so probably it will be in the exam this year. Usually there's a question related to environmental problems that come from the use of fuel or the use of organic compounds like CFC. So CFC wasn't in the exam last year. And I would expect that it might be in the exam this year. So please make sure that you know about its environmental problems and all of its reactions. And then polymers. Polymers is again one of the topics that comes in the exam in one or another form. So it hasn't been in the exam last year. So I would make sure that I cover the polymers, understand both of the types of polymers, the addition polymers and condensation polymers, and how to draw the repeating units of polymer. Also with NMR, I wouldn't at all exclude the TMS or the reference material we use in NMR, and also the different solvents we use for the NMR and why these solvents are particularly important. Because this is one of the things that hasn't been in the exam lately, and maybe there will be a question related to that this year. So just make sure that you know this bit. Also, reduction reactions and the use of different reducing agents to get the amines. So there wasn't much questions about reduction last year. Was a simple question where cyanide was reduced into an amine using hydrogen. So pay attention to the different reducing agents because I would think that this year probably there will be a question about reduction. And there are topics which are, in my opinion, less likely, but still, I would never exclude anything. So they're still possible. So first topic is cracking. Cracking is not one of the hot topics in the exam. And there was a question about cracking last year. It's quite unlikely that there will be another question about cracking this year because they don't usually repeat themselves that much, especially with the less common questions. But everything is possible. I can never read the minds of the examiner. And then stability of the benzene ring, one of the least likely questions, in my opinion, because last year there was a 6 mark questions related to the stability of the benzene ring, and they would never repeat the same question again 2 years in a row. And then amines, because last year there was a long question about amines, primary, secondary, and tertiary amines, the viscosity of amines, and so on. And if amines comes in the exam, it wouldn't be a big question. It would be embedded somehow within other questions. And finally, ester preparation as a practical. Last year, the practical that came and the paper two was about ester preparation. So they wouldn't repeat the same practical 2 years in a row. And then I want you to pay attention to these topics because these are not very common in the exam and they haven't been in the exam lately. So just make sure, and you wouldn't find many practice questions as well in the past papers related to these topics. So just pay attention to these topics. Make sure that you at least know how to answer these topics. So Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution curve, not very common, hasn't been in the exam lately. So just make sure that you know about the maximum Boltzmann distribution curve. Hess cycle. So Hess cycle is one of these topics which overlap between paper one and paper two. Usually the Born-Haber cycle is one of the hot topics in paper one. My prediction that Born-Haber cycle will be in paper one anyway, and it's kind of Hess cycle, but sometimes they like to ask questions about his cycle in paper two as well, even though there was a question in paper one. So make sure that you cover this quickly for paper two as well. And then proteins and enzymes. Protein and enzymes, one of the topics that hardly come in the exam. But when this topic comes in the exam, it comes as a very long question. And there aren't many practice questions as well. So I would pay attention to this topic so I wouldn't lose a lot of marks in my exam just in case it comes in the exam this year, just in case the examiner decides that, yes, I want to put a question about proteins and enzymes this year. So make sure that you know about proteins and enzymes, their structure, and also to find any past paper questions related to this topic, answer these type of questions just to get a taste of what kind of questions you might be asked.